All right, good afternoon. It's good to see everybody here today. We had a few out last week, and then they're back, and some of the ones that were here last week are out this week. So just the way it goes. Seems like we passed something from one to the next, but continue to pray for those that are not feeling well, that they'll be able to get back with us soon. We are thankful for answered prayer, as we made mention of in our prayer requests this morning. I know Samuel, somebody that the kids have association with through co-op, is doing better, so thankful for that. Addie, Sierra's friend, is out of the hospital, so that's good. But continue to pray for her. And again, multiple other families that we've been praying for a lot recently. Just continue to do so as they come to your mind. Pray for us as we look to potentially organize from a mission work into a church. We're exploring that. I have a meeting tomorrow to talk about the legality side of some of that in regards to transferring of things, and just to learn a little bit more about that. And then me and Brother Wayne, again, are talking about some of the things that would need to be done more from the spiritual side of things. So pray for us as we look into that. We are going to be in the book of Psalms chapter 78 today. Psalms chapter 78. We've done really good progress by covering a chapter for every Sunday, but that kind of came to a screeching halt in Psalms chapter 78 since there's 72 verses and I have trouble getting through 10 verses in one sermon. But it's been good to go through this. It's interesting. When you look at the top of different Bibles will have different ways they may divide up that chapter with different subheadings and things like that. In the one that I use, it says, Telling the Coming Generations. And I think that's a pretty good title for the chapter. And for those that haven't been here, we're down almost to the very end, but I'll give you a few sneak peeks of what you've missed. There's a couple aspects. The first part, there's actually a quote at the very beginning that is attributed to the Lord Jesus Christ. It talks about how that he's going to speak in dark sayings of old and that he's going to open his mouth in parables. We learn in the New Testament that the Lord is of himself says that that's what he's doing, and he's fulfilling this passage here, and it talks about how he speaks to the people in his generation through parables. But that's almost a passing comment at the beginning of this. And really the rest of this chapter deals with the idea of making sure that we pass on from generation to generation to generation the things of God. Now, there's plenty of places in the Bible that give us that principle, right? I think about the times when the children of Israel crossed over Jordan miraculously, and they were told that they needed to take those 12 stones, and they put up these 12 stones, and that was to be a memorial so that in the generations to come, when their kids would say, why are these 12 stones here? That they would have the opportunity to what? They would have the opportunity to say, well, let me tell you about what God did for us. Let me tell you about how amazing God's deliverance is, how he brought our people out of the land of Egypt, and he fed us, and he watered us, and he led us. And then when he brought us as he brings us into the promised land, he performs this great miracle, allowing us to cross over the river. And this is all about reminding the generations to come of what God had done for them, right? Similar principle in Psalms chapter 78. But one thing that's different about Psalms chapter 78 is it actually focuses a whole lot on the negative side, okay? So listen, the 12 stones, they were meant to talk about how amazing God was and how amazing God had blessed the people. Psalm chapter 78, it does go over the amazing things that God has done, but the focus of Psalm chapter 78 is the fact that despite what God had done, the people were hard-hearted. The people were disobedient. The people didn't serve him. They followed after other gods. And I think the idea here is you need to do two things. You need to be telling the generation to come and your grandkids, and if you have the great opportunity, your great-grandkids, the amazing things that God has done, but you also need to tell them the consequences of not serving God. That's a whole lot of what Psalm chapter 78 focuses on. God did these amazing things, and yet the people did this. And God chastised them. And then God did these amazing things for them, and yet they sinned even more. That's what happens in Psalm chapter 78. That's what, at the beginning of this chapter, he says, I'm going to make sure to tell my kids and my grandkids and my kids' kids and my great-grandkids, so to speak, what the Lord did and what our fathers did. Right? There's a distinction. What did God do? What did our fathers do? And what were the consequences of what they did? So, for example, he talks about how that God did marvelous things in the sight of the fathers in the land of Egypt, and how they saw all those things, and how he parted the Red Sea. But in verse 17 of Psalm 78, it says, and they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness, and they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust. The next part then goes into showing how God gave them of the desires of their heart. But in verse 32 it says, for all of this they sinned still and believed not his wondrous works. So in the first verse you see that they're provoking and they're tempting God. In verse 32 you're seeing that they don't believe in his wondrous works. In verse 36 it says, nevertheless they did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues, for their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. So you see that even in times when they claimed God, when they claimed him, the Bible describes that they were actually lying and that they really didn't honor him in their heart. And then you see in verse 41, yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They limited him. When another opportunity arose where they didn't know how the Lord was going to deliver them, instead of thinking, I wonder how God is going to do it this time, they said, why didn't God just leave us in Egypt? Don't you remember all the great things we had back then? God can't help us this time. They limited God. So what do you see? The pattern there, right? They provoked him, they tempted him, they didn't believe him, they lied to him, they limited God. And even after verse 41, it goes in and it talks about all of the plagues of Egypt and how the Lord had shown them his power and how he had basically conquered every god that the Egyptians worshipped through those plagues. And yet still they tempted and didn't believe. In verse 56 it says, yea, they tempted and provoked the Most High God and kept not his testimonies, but turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. Now at this point, I believe when you get down to verse 56, you're actually starting to get away from the people that came out of Egypt. And now you're talking about a different generation, because it talks about how that they were unfaithful like their fathers were unfaithful. So he tells them, you know, the people that came out of Egypt, they saw this and it was amazing, and yet they tempted God. They saw this, and yet they lied to God. They saw this, and they provoked God. They saw this, and yet they still limited God. And then the next generation, or a few generations go by, and the next thing you know, it says that they're back to tempting and provoking the Most High and not keeping his testimonies, and that they turned back and dealt unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow. And the rest of these verses here, the next few verses, describe how they were unfaithful. It says in verse 58, for they provoked him to anger with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. When God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel. so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and he delivered his strength unto captivity, and his glory unto the enemy's hands. He gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awakened as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouteth by reason of wine, and he smote his enemies in the hinder parts, and put them unto a perpetual reproach. Moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph, and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, but chose the tribe of Judah, the Mount Zion, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth which he had established forever. And he chose David also his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from following the ewes, great with the young. He brought him to feed Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart, and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Now you see here by the end of the chapter, the Lord is back to blessing them, right? They provoke the Lord, they turn from him, they seek after other gods, they worship in high places. They're not doing it the way that God said to do it. God sends judgment and chastisement, and you see some of that recap there. And then by the end, he comes along and he says, when the Lord came back to them, when the Lord started blessing them again, he actually chose Judah, and it was in Judah that he took David and made this lowly shepherd the king, and he set that in. He set the center of the nation in Jerusalem, and he set the center of worship in Jerusalem, and he would eventually have the temple built in Jerusalem, and the Lord was blessing. I think there's more to it than that. I think, again, it's a reference to the fact that the promised seed would also come through Judah, that's who he chose, right, for our deliverance. But even if you don't go that far, again, I think you see the idea here that when the Lord came back and the Lord started to bless them again, that he did so through the tribe of Judah, not through the tribe of Joseph. And there's a reason for that statement. And we'll get into that a little bit today. What we've been trying to do as we go through this is we take places that this chapter talks about where the children of Israel didn't do what they were supposed to do, and we actually go read those to put a little bit of context around Psalm chapter 78. Now, I think there's actually multiple places that you could talk about in this last pace where it says that they had their high places and they were worshiping graven images and they weren't serving God. Unfortunately, as you look at the history in the time of the judges and even honestly in the time of the kings, it was kind of like this the whole time. They'd serve God and then they wouldn't, and they'd go after graven images, and then they'd get chastisement, and they'd come back and they'd serve God for a little bit, and then they'd go right back into that idol worship. And a lot of that traces back, by the way, to the fact that they didn't do what God originally told them to do, right? God told them to chase out all of the other nations, and they elected not to do that. And God even told Moses that would happen. And then when it started to happen, God told them, like, okay, you didn't do what I said. I'm going to leave them there, and they are going to be a thorn in your side. And they are going to drive you away from me. And you see that, and it came to be, right? Psalm 78 is saying, listen, tell your kids, tell your grandkids, tell your great-grandkids, these are the amazing things that God did. When you don't serve God, here's the consequences. Here's the consequences. I think you also see in this a lesson about God's amazing grace, mercy, long-suffering. Because you see time and time again, like God had patience with them. God came back to them. God delivered them yet again. It even says in Psalm chapter 78 that he was wroth with them, but basically he remembered that they were just human, that they were just men, and he showed mercy, right? So you learn a lot. There's a lot that we need to be telling the generation coming up around us. But let's talk about, I'm going to use one example. I think there's multiple places you could talk about for where this could be referring to, but I'm going to use one example. It says in verse 60 that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength unto captivity and his glory unto the enemy's hands. And it goes on to talk about how that there would be great loss of the people through the sword, that their priests would fall and the widows would have no lamentation. I mean, that's a picture of great judgment and condemnation that's coming down on them. What I want you to do is I want you to think about a story. You're probably familiar with this. I want you to think about a time when the nation of Israel lost the Ark of the Covenant. And there's some things I think you need to understand. We know from Scripture that when the children of Israel settled in the Promised Land, do you remember the tabernacle that they took through the wilderness? Right? And they had this whole tabernacle that Moses built, and in the tabernacle was also where the Ark of the Covenant was stored. Do you know when they settled in the land of Canaan, that tabernacle and Ark of the Covenant settled in a place called Shiloh? This passage tells us what? It tells us that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength unto captivity and his glory into the enemy's hands. There was a time in the nation of Israel when they weren't what they were supposed to be, and there was great sin among the nation. And they went to battle with the Philistines, and they were losing. And so you know what they decided to do? Well, let's go get the Ark of the Covenant, because we can't lose if we have the Ark of the Covenant. So they went to Shiloh, and they got the Ark of the Covenant out of Shiloh, and they brought it to where their battle was with the Philistines. And they lost. Not only did they lose, but their priests were slain. Not only did they lose and they have their priests slain, but the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant. Psalm 78 says that he let his strength be taken captivity, be taken into captivity. It also told us that their priests would be slain. It told us that many people would die by the sword. Why? Because there was sin and unbelief in the nation. There's a lot to this story, and you almost can't start with the summary that I gave. This story is, you can find it in the book of 1 Samuel. The first few chapters you're probably pretty familiar with. The first few chapters are introducing you or building you up to introduce you to the prophet Samuel. And it starts with this guy who's got a couple wives, right? And one of them is having kids and one of them's not. And she's very heartbroken and she's tormented by the other one. And she goes before the Lord and she prays that the Lord would give her a child. And if the Lord would give her a child, she's going to give that child to the Lord. Samuel's born. She gives him to the Lord. And he is in this place. He would have been in Shiloh, by the way. You know what? He's with a guy by the name of Eli. Now, Eli himself is not too bad of a guy. He's been a judge over the nation of Israel. But he's got two sons that are priests. And listen, those two sons, they are crooked as crooked can be. Right? And you start to see some of that when you get into 1 Samuel chapter 2. Let me read you this just to give you an idea. Now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he said unto them, Why do ye such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, it is no good report that I hear. Ye make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearken not unto the voice of the Lord the voice of their father because the Lord would slay them. This is the people that we're talking about. These are the people that are in charge of the Ark of the Covenant at the time. We find that when the Ark goes to battle, it's these two guys that go with it. These guys who are supposed to be priests of the Lord, these guys who are supposed to be the people that are judging right and wrong in the nation. And yet what you find, if you'd read earlier, people would come to bring their sacrifice and they would send their goons out to steal some of the sacrifice before it was supposed to be. Some people that were doing right would even say, please don't do this. Like, this isn't right. Wait until the offering has been made. And they would force them to give them of the sacrifice. They were polluting the things of God. And not only that, they were causing others to pollute the things of God. They were literally turning the house of God, this tabernacle of God, into a place of fornication and a place of prostitution, and horrible, horrible stuff was going on. That's the condition of the nation at that time. And in the last half of chapter 2, we won't read it for time's sake, you see that the Lord actually came to Eli through Samuel and basically said that he was going to cut off his family. And that because of the sin of his sons, and because Eli didn't do anything about it, that he was going to cut off the house of Eli completely. Now, when you turn over to chapter 3, you see that the Lord calls Samuel, right? And you see this whole story that we know about. We're not going to read it again for time's sake. Here am I, right? The Lord was calling Samuel, and Samuel kept going into Eli, thinking it was Eli. And you see all those things, and the Lord reveals some stuff to Eli. Now, turn over to chapter 4. I just wanted you to get the context leading up to chapter 4. It says, "And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle and pitched beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines pitched in Aphek. And the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel, and when they joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. And when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, Wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. So the people sent to Shiloh, that they might bring from thence the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth between the cherubs, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, What meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews? And they understood that the ark of the Lord was come unto the camp. And the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into the camp. And they said, Woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing heretofore. Woe unto us, who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Notice how that generations later, they still remembered what had happened in Egypt. They still remembered. This is the Philistines saying some of this, by the way. It says, verse 9, Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O ye Philistines, that ye be not servants unto the Hebrews as they have been to you. Quit yourselves like men and fight. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten. It's just so interesting to me, right? Even the Philistines saw the Ark of the Covenant coming and thought, oh, it is over for us. We are in trouble. This is the thing that represents the God that destroyed Egypt, that brought these people out of the land. It's amazing to me that sometimes the enemies of God remember the stories and the works of God better than the children of the people who went through it. You don't see the nation of Israel coming and saying, we serve the God that brought us out of Egypt. You see them say, let's go get the Ark of the Covenant, because if we got the Ark of the Covenant with us, we can't lose. They didn't say we can't lose without God. They said we can't lose if we got the Ark of the Covenant. But the Philistines said, oh, this is the God that brought them out of Egypt, that did all the plagues. We're in trouble. But they said, you know what? We're going to keep going anyways. We're going to fight this battle. He basically said, stop being babies, act like men, and let's go fight because we don't want to be servants to these Hebrews. And to their surprise, and I really do think that, right? To their surprise, they actually won. They actually won. Psalms declares that the Lord let his strength be taken captive. I think that phrase shows just how surprising it was that the nation of Israel lost. The Philistines thought, oh, this is the strength of God, and yet the Lord let them take the Ark of the Covenant captive. It says that Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent, and there was a great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. Now by the time this battle is over, they've lost 30,000 men, they've lost the Ark of the Covenant, and they've lost two of their priests. 30,000 lost soldiers means a whole lot of widows and a whole lot of children that will never be born. It really does seem to match very well to what part of what's described in Psalm chapter 78, doesn't it? But it gets even more specific. In verse 12, it says, there ran a man of Benjamin out of the army and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes rent, with earth upon his head. And when he came, lo, Eli sat upon a seat by the wayside watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told it, all the city cried out. And when Eli heard the noise of the crying, he said, what meaneth the noise of this tumult? And the man came in hastily and told Eli. And now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were dim that he could not see. And the man said unto Eli, I am he that came out of the army, and fled today out of the army. And he said, what is there done, my son? And the messenger answered and said, Israel is fled before the Philistines. Blow number 1. And there hath been also a great slaughter among the people. Blow number 2. And thy sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. Blow number 3. And the ark of God is taken. Final blow. It says, and it came to pass, when he made mention of the ark of God, that he fell down from off the seat backwards by the side of the gate, and his neck broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. In one day, the 3 main priests died. Psalm 78 said, your priests are going to be killed. It goes on. It says in verse 19, and his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was with child, near to be delivered. And when she heard the tidings that the ark of God was taken, that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself and travailed, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her birth, the women that stood by said unto her, fear not, for thou hast borne a son. But she answered not, neither did she regard it. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory is departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken. You see the destruction and the turmoil and the tumult that's happened, all the way down even to the priest's widow, who doesn't seem necessarily to mourn. Her and Eli mourned, I think, more for the Ark of the Covenant being gone. Great condemnation, great judgment came because the nation was full of sin. The nation had turned from God. The nation was not serving God like they should. And they lost the battle. They lost the Ark of the Covenant. They lost their priests. And great, great condemnation came upon them. Listen, this is a story. It's not a pleasant story. It's not one we enjoy hearing. But did you know that it is important that people understand the consequences of not serving God? This is one of the stories, I believe, that Psalm chapter 78 is saying we are going to tell our generation and the generation after that and the generation after that because we don't want them to forget. We don't want them to forget how amazing God has been to us. We don't want them to forget how much He's done for us and what He's brought us through. But we also don't want our kids to forget that when God has done amazing things for them, our fathers were hard-hearted, were unfaithful, were unbelieving, provoked God, tempted God. We need to understand. We need to understand the things that we do and the consequences that they have. I want my kids to know, you know what? God was merciful to me, and God was gracious to me, and God redeemed me, and God saved me out of so many things. And in the course of my life, I've seen Him bless me. But listen, you also need to know there have been times in my life where I wasn't serving God and I wasn't doing the things I should do. And you know what? There's things that I still live with today because of those things. It's important that kids and generations know the Word of God, the things of God, and for you personally even, what He's done for you. Now, one interesting thought. Did you guys ever realize that, like, the tabernacle traveled with the nation, Ark of the Covenant, when they would stop and set up the tabernacle, Ark of the Covenant would be in there. When they took over the land, I told you that they set up the tabernacle in Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant was there in Shiloh. Did you know that at this point, the Ark of the Covenant, from what I've read and from what I can tell, the Ark of the Covenant never went back to Shiloh? What you read is that it went with the Philistines for a while. They had lots of problems with the Ark of the Covenant, didn't they? They wanted it gone. And so they sent it somewhere. And some people did some stuff to it they shouldn't to, and condemnation came to them. And they called somebody else, and they said, come and get this thing. We don't want it. And you know, it sat there for like 20 some odd years or longer. And what we find is that David eventually called for the Ark of the Covenant to be brought. And it seems, from what I read, that he set up a tent in Jerusalem for the Ark of the Covenant. And then eventually Solomon came along and built the temple, and the Ark of the Covenant was put in the temple. But from what I can read, it never went back to Shiloh after the Philistines captured it. And what did Psalm 78 say? Psalm 78 said that he had forsaken his tabernacle at Shiloh and let his strength be taken captive. That's in verse 60. So he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and he delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into his enemies' hands, and he gave his people over unto the sword and was wroth with his inheritance. Just an interesting note there. Like, lots of times we miss that. The Ark of the Covenant, from what I can tell, never went back. Never went back to Shiloh. Shiloh, by the way, was within the territory of Ephraim. And this passage also says that whenever the Lord came back and started blessing them again, he took up residence in Judah, and he never went back to Ephraim. And that is what you see in that. Ark of the Covenant comes back. When it comes back, it comes to Jerusalem. And then from there, it's put in the temple once Solomon builds the temple. But never went back to Shiloh, never went back to the land of Ephraim again. Now, this chapter does end on a really positive note. It says in verse 68, "But chose the tribe of Judah, the mount of Zion, which he loved. And he built a sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth, which he had established forever. He chose David also, his servant, and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes, great with young, he brought him to feed Jacob his people and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them with the skillfulness of his hands." You see again God providing for the nation that he loved. He provided for the children of Israel. Even though they had sinned, even though they got off path, even though they weren't what they should have been, judgment came. A time whenever they finally said, "We need a king," and God said, "You don't need a king. You're supposed to, I'm your king. Oh, we need a king like everybody else." And he gave him a king, and you know how Saul was. That didn't turn out so well for him, did it? And yet, even in all of that, the Lord was merciful, and he gave them David, a king who turned out to be a man after God's own heart, a king that loved Israel, a king that loved God, a king that wanted to see them serve God. And God took that guy who was nothing but a lowly shepherd, and he made him king. And it was through David and through his lineage that he strengthened the nation of Israel, that he strengthened Jerusalem, that he built up Jerusalem. And then when Solomon came along and he built it up even more. But more importantly, through David, you'd have a direct lineage to Jesus Christ, the Messiah, right? And you'd see promises that were given to David about how that his son, his seed, would rule and reign forever. And we see the fulfillment of that through Jesus Christ. So yes,